Hello. I'm a little nervous because, of course, what I have to say, I think, is going to be much less exciting than what Wiebel said. I don't know what he said, but it sounded really fun. But I'm really overwhelmed by the extent of the welcome that I'm receiving here in California. But in some ways, I'm not surprised. I lived in Cambodia for 5 years, and they were some of the best years of my life, primarily because of the warmth and the friendliness of the people. But I came away with very mixed feelings. On the one hand, of course, I fell in love with your beautiful country. But on the other hand, I felt increasingly disturbed by the political reality in Cambodia, whereby the vast majority of people, particularly poor people, are being horribly exploited, sometimes brutally, by a very small number of officials and their families. As you all know, over the last 20 years, there's been a real scramble for Cambodian resources as a tiny group of ruling elite carve out the best parcels for themselves, and they sell these to the highest bidder without any consideration of the consequences, either the environmental consequences or the social consequences. And the consequences have been devastating for your country. Millions of hectares have been illegally grabbed and sold off in economic land concessions. Your ancient forests have been felled, your rivers dammed and polluted. And of course, perhaps worst of all, thousands upon thousands of people have been forcibly evicted from their land and from their homes. And as we are witnessing now, there is increasing social instability as people fight to maintain their homes or as they demonstrate for a livable wage. And we all know the consequences as this tiny group become vastly wealthy. Ordinary Cambodians are pushed deeper and deeper into poverty, and it's now estimated that the richest 1% in Cambodia own 20 to 30% of the land area. And meanwhile, 1/5 of the rural population are completely landless. Families have become increasingly desperate to survive. In 2012, the International Labour Organization estimated that there were 429,000 child labourers now in Cambodia. But of course the victims of this system are not just the ordinary Cambodians today. They are the future generations of Cambodians. And unless something is done to stop this pillage of resources, then your children and your grandchildren will inherit a Cambodia where most of the valuable resources have been siphoned off and sold. And as we know from human rights monitors, to implement this frenzied carve-up of Cambodia, the ruling elite have committed mass human rights abuses. In Phnom Penh, at least 145,000 people have been evicted from their homes since 2000. Nationwide, NGOs estimate that up to 770,000 people are adversely affected by land grabbing. Not all of those have been evicted yet, but those who haven't are awaiting the same fate. And just to give you a sense of how bad it has become, to give you a sense of scale, I said that 6% of the people had been affected. If this number as a percentage of population had been affected in the United States, it would amount to the entire populations of several states put together. Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho and Hawaii all put together. And tolerating that scale of human rights abuse in the United States would be unthinkable. And what we have to say is that poor Cambodians deserve to be treated with the same level of protection. But there's reason to be hopeful. Clearly, there's many responsible Cambodians like yourselves who are not prepared to see the ruling elite destroy the country for future generations. I was asked to look into the killings that happened on the 3rd of January last year. When I started to look at those killings, I realized that there were many other serious human rights abuses that were all linked. In fact, whether we're talking about forcible evictions of poor families, or the assassination of trade union leaders, or the persecution of opposition politicians, these are all part of a much broader policy. And that policy is implemented by state actors, often the police, the gendarmes, the army, for the benefit of the ruling elite. And it has two main objectives. The first, as you're very aware, is the self-enrichment of themselves, particularly through land grabbing. And the second, which is necessary for the first, is the maintenance of power and the suppression of dissidents. And so I expanded the investigation, and what we found is that when all these human rights violations are considered collectively, when they're looked at together, they satisfy all the elements of crimes against humanity. And on that basis, we filed a communication on the 7th of October with the prosecutor of the ICC. And this is a communication here with 450 pages and 1,000 footnotes and 8 annexes. It's the most comprehensive document on human rights abuses in Cambodia ever written. And so we hope that the prosecutor will agree with our arguments, that the facts on the ground satisfy the elements of crimes against humanity, and we hope that sometime this year or early next year she will open an investigation. So far we've had a great deal of support for this initiative. When we filed it, 2 of the world's most influential NGOs, FIDH, the biggest French NGO, human rights NGO, and Global Witness were extremely supportive of the process. We've also, more recently, we've filed a letter from 40 NGOs expressing their support for this communication. The political group Liberal International was also extremely supportive, and the president of Liberal International stated that this is a case cut out for the ICC. And of course, it received very detailed coverage in some of the world's leading newspapers, including the Financial Times, Le Figaro from France, El Pas from Spain, BBC, Forbes, and many others. It's also been discussed in the European Parliament, where it was raised by the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Committee, and after she raised it, the European Foreign Service confirmed that they take it very seriously, and we'll continue to look at it very, very seriously. The question is, what further work can we do to keep pushing this initiative so that the ICC prosecutor realises that the international community cares about this case and will not let ordinary Cambodians be sacrificed to the forces of greed and power? Well, the main thing we want to do is to file a supplementary brief. After I filed the communication, many people who had heard about it contacted me and they said, I have more information, I have more evidence, I can be a witness. And what we need to do is we need to collate and analyse those extra thousands of pages of evidence and to see how they can support the arguments that we've already made. We also want to show that since we filed it, these crimes are continuing. It's not as if the land grabbing has stopped. It's not as if the persecution has stopped. The crimes are continuing to happen. And one thing we want to do is we want to get all the latest information and add that to a new supplementary communication and file that to show the ICC prosecutor that she really must act so that the numbers of victims doesn't grow. We also need to keep this initiative alive. It's very important that the ICC prosecutor sees that people care about this, not just in Cambodia, but people around the world. Because the ICC only has limited resources. So the prosecutor has to choose from her large pile of potential cases which ones she's going to follow through with. And we need to convince her that the case of Cambodia is one of the ones she must open. So we will continue with our political advocacy. There's going to be another debate on this communication in the European Parliament on the 22nd of January. I've been told that the issue will be raised again, and the European Commission will have to provide a formal response to the Parliament about their position on these issues. Given the resources, we're also going to work with European parliamentarians and ask them to raise this issue in their parliaments. And we will collect the questions and answers and we will send those to the ICC prosecutor. And lastly, I will meet next week with various congressmen and senators in Washington, D.C. Who are interested in this issue, Ed Royce and others, who are very, very strong supporters of the Cambodian people, and we'll see what type of support he can lend to us on this issue. So, just to conclude, because I know that you're keen to ask some questions, with the ICC filing, we've created momentum to finally bring some measure of justice to the Cambodian people. There's no guarantee that the ICC will end up indicting the ruling elite. I cannot guarantee that. But what we've done is we've created a document that outlines all the facts that are necessary to open an investigation, and we have collected support from civil society and various other actors that we hope will encourage the prosecutor to do so. This is an historic opportunity to finally bring justice to the Cambodian people, and we need to give it our best shot. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard, for your long list of សង្ខេបឲ្យជូនបងប្អូនលោកអ៊ំលោកពូនិងមីង ពីព្រោះអ្វីដែលគាត់លើកឡើងនេះគឺពាក់ព័ន្ធទៅនឹងដំណើរការនៃការដាក់ពាក្យបណ្ដឹងនេះគឺវាមានការពាក់ព័ន្ធទៅនឹងភ័ស្តុតាងស៊ីជម្រៅជាច្រើនហើយត្រូវការពេលវេលាដើម្បីបើសិនជាបកប្រែជាភាសាខ្មែរឲ្យបានលម្អិតដូចនៅអ្វីដែលគាត់លើកឡើងហ្នឹងគឺត្រូវចំណាយពេលច្រើនណាស់បាទដោយសារយើងមានពេលវេលាខ្លីយើងត្រូវឡើងយន្តហោះណាមកប្រហែលជា2ណាបងបាទ2:45ទៅ Washington State ថែមទៀតដូច្នេះខ្ញុំចង់សង្ខេបនៅអ្វីដែលជាចុងក្រោយដែលគាត់បាននិយាយលើកឡើងដែលមានសារៈសំខាន់ហើយចង់ផ្ដល់ជាក្តីសង្ឃឹមទៅដល់លោកតាលោកយាយលោកពូដែលមិញដែលមកនៅថ្ងៃនេះថា